In mid-July, we're about as far removed as possible from the Stanley Cup final. But on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, I'm going to tell you why, even with all of the losses this offseason, the Oilers are very much contenders. Today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So if you're an everydayer to Locked On Oilers from this past season, you heard me do a variation of this show several times, and I called it the elevator pitch. The idea how you can explain or rationalize to yourself how the Oilers can win the Stanley Cup this season. And some of this is projection and guessing, because there are some question marks about the lineup, who's going to play what role. But the Oilers very much are a Stanley Cup contender. They're going to enter the season as one of the 5 best odds to win the whole thing. So we're going to start out with my biggest reason, which should be an improved defense in the regular season and what that does for the rest of the team. In our second segment, we'll pivot to talking about the upside potential for the winger groups that the Oilers have assembled this offseason. And then in our final segment, I will talk a little bit more about the intangibles and the experiences of the last 2 years and how that's only going to help a veteran-laden group. So to start things out, and I know I spent a lot of last season talking about the defense, and I have largely felt, and it is a naturally symbiotic relationship. All 3 components of goaltending, defense, and forwards, they all naturally intersect because they're on the ice at the same time. Because they all interact with each other and play off of each other, there is an inherent connection between them. And because of that connection, while some components of the game are more influential to the game's outcome, more forward talent, the better forward you have, the more likely you are to score. That's helpful. I do think there is something to be said for the Oilers having a more stable, steady defensive group for the length of the regular season. So if you'll recall, back to last October of 2024, the Oilers entered the season with question marks health-wise. Mattias Ekholm, a little bit dinged up coming off of the long playoffs the year before. Darnell Nurse coming off of a long playoffs, didn't participate in the preseason. Didn't look good for that first month, and things settled down over time. But that first month, the Oilers very much were a piecemeal effort. You saw appearances by Josh Brown, by Travis Dermott, by Troy Stecher. Brett Kulak played the most minutes on an average basis of any season of his career this past year, and he was largely the solution to the Oilers' depth problem, because coming into the season, we knew unequivocally they needed at least one more defenseman in that group because they just didn't have it. And they tried Ty Emberson on that second pair. They tried Troy Stecher. They ultimately did Brett Kulak and Nurse together, and that played a lot of minutes together. But it took the Oilers quite a while to assemble a group that they felt okay with. And then once they got close enough to the trade deadline, they went out and made a very shrewd move. I have always liked what Jake Walman brings to the table, and I think that's my big key here. Yes, Darnell Nurse, for what his contract is, probably not going to be worth it for the Oilers. If there were an ideal world where the Oilers could find a way to move him, there likely would be a way. They probably would. If the Oilers could get out from under that contract, $9.25 million is a lot of money in the NHL. I know the cap's going to keep going up and that number becomes a little more palatable by the season, but at the same time, $9.25 million is a starting goalie and another top 9 forward. And I know the Oilers need another defenseman, and we'll talk about that in a minute here in this first segment, but even if you need one more defenseman, you don't have the money. If you could hypothetically turn Darnell Nurse into, say, John Gibson, who's making like 6.5 for Detroit now, and another top 9 forward. Like, just for example, let's say they wanted to keep Jeff Skinner or bring Jeff Skinner back or keep Victor Arvidsson, whatever, one of those two, just as an example. You would have had the money to do that. You could have had a starting goalie and an extra forward in this group. And look, I like what they ultimately did, and I don't want to get ahead to talking about Ike Howard too early because he'll be prominently featured in the second segment, but there is something to be said for the fact that they have Walman, who has familiarity now because he's been here for a quarter season and a playoff run. He has familiarity. Chris Knobloch, for the most part, trusts him. And because of that, there's room here. There is room for Jake Walman to play his way both into another contract and into a bigger role on this team. Now, you heard me say it a bunch last year that when the Oilers are in a pinch, I would love to see them run Bouchard and Walman together as an offense-first defensive pair to really try and tilt the ice. They have that in their disposal. They have, if Mattias Ekholm is able to get back closer to what he was a year and a half ago when he was healthy, it would put you in a position to have one of the best first pairs in all of hockey again. And when you have that, and you have Brett Kulak and then Troy Stetcher or Ty Emberson as your third pair, you really just need to figure out your matchup pair. And Jake Walman is one of the guys, and you would assume Darnell Nurse would be the other. Now, neither Walman nor Nurse is particularly adept at defensive defense. You know, they're not great at preventing zone entries. They're not great at taking away shooting lanes or preventing it. Walman's effective at defense because he's an adept puck mover. He can get where he needs to relatively okay because he's a strong skater, and he's going to get in position. Nurse, the volatility in his play is eye-watering, to say the least. He is a player that you truly don't know what he's going to do until he goes out there and does it. It's very flummoxing to watch a player who very clearly has physical gifts, especially in terms of his skating for his size, and it just doesn't come together for him in a way some other players are able to translate their physical skills more. And look, that's not to demean Nurse's character. It's not to demean Darnell Nurse the person. He's a good dude. The guys on the team like him. The community values him. None of that is in dispute. But at the very least, we all know he can't be making the money he's making if the Oilers want to stay super contenders for long. Now, they have responded to some of the issues, the roster questions, I should say, not issues, in trying to play for upside. And as a firm believer in shooting for ceiling, not floor, the decisions they've made on the wing in terms of guys like Matthew Savoie, Ike Howard, and Vasily Podkolzin, for that matter, which we're all going to get to, are inherently tied to this defense conversation because the Oilers feel that defensively they're going to be pretty good. And I know that's a bit tricky to evaluate because the goaltending is so poor and below league average that a lot of the time when the Oilers have a bad game, it gets away from them very quickly because they have to cheat for offense and their defense gets put out on islands and they have to make one-on-one plays. And that's how you start to get picked apart. And it's what Florida did so well as this past year, the 2025 Cup final went on. You make Oilers defensemen make individual plays, you can start to flummox them. You can start to make them uncomfortable. You can force them into mistakes. And over time, it is really hard to play great defense. And it's why offense kind of is always going to be more valuable. Offense inherently is always going to be more valuable. So the fact that the Oilers, who have a less talented forward group on paper than the one they brought into last season, feel like their defense is going to be able to take a bigger share of the load, I agree, because Jake Walman is better than Kulak, than Nurse, than Emberson, than Stetcher, than Dermott, than Josh Brown. Any of the guys they've rotated in after Ekholm and Bouchard last year, I have no qualms about saying Walman is the best one out of all of them. And that pushes everyone else down a spot. You know, that moves Nurse into a little bit better of a role because he's got a better partner. That moves Kulak down to a third pair where he's going to be one of the better third pair left-handed defensemen in the NHL, and he's someone Chris Knobloch implicitly trusts. That puts you in a position where you might be able to offset some of the variance within your forward group by playing better defense. And speaking of the volatility in the forward group, we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we're going to talk about why this forward group, though a lot less proven than last year's team, the ceiling makes it interesting as far as why you should believe this Oilers team could go all the way on today's edition of Locked on Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Did you just realize your business needed to hire someone like yesterday? How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs. Put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. We have all been in that spot where our team needs someone like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a setback to you and your team. That's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. And now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored jobs credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we enter not quite the dog days of summer, but we're definitely getting to a lull in the hockey cycle. We got a new CBA last week, which we'll talk about a little bit later this upcoming week. We'll talk about what it means for the Oilers, what it means in the greater macroeconomic trends of the NHL at large, and most of all, what it says about where we're going as a league and a sport. Because those big picture conversations, they're very tricky to do in the moment because you don't know what the effect of some of these decisions is going to be. You know, like we all joke about the professional emergency backup goalie now and getting rid of the chance for guys like David Ayers to come into the game for the Leafs, for the Hurricanes against the Leafs. But circling back to the Oilers, who this episode is about, because this is Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day, and we're talking about it through the lens of why, even with all the uncertainty, you should have a decent bit of confidence the Oilers are it is well within the Oilers' range of outcomes that they win the Stanley Cup next year. And look, am I a bit too much of a realist at times? Do I occasionally roll over from skeptical to cynical? And yeah, I think as somebody who has spent as much time as I have around sports, watching sports, consuming sports, making content, writing, making videos, doing podcasts about sports, more often than not, the teams that have the too many ranges of outcomes, they don't get where they need to go. Teams that have high floors and high ceilings. A high floor, that gets you in the playoffs. A high ceiling wins you the whole thing. And we talked about the Oilers' defense being a little bit more steady, reliable, dependable in that first segment. And I think naturally, should the Oilers' defense be about what it was last year, where they were, by the metrics, a top 5 to 10 defense in the NHL, depending on which models you look at, that tells you, and they did that with I don't want to say a MASH unit because it wasn't because of injuries, but a less than stellar unit. You know, Ty Emberson got his first real cup of coffee at the NHL level. And though Chris Knobloch didn't particularly trust him, I felt he was learning, he was growing, he was getting better. I think Troy Stecher is amongst the most ideal seventh defenseman you can have because he can play pretty much anywhere in your lineup because of his skill set. Now, I don't think for a long-term replacement for an injury, you could afford him in your top 6. But in spurts, I think there's enough puck skill there and enough skating ability to make up for his size, his inability to clear the net front, maybe win puck battles as much as you would like for someone who's going to be on one of your first 2 pairs. But in terms of the Oilers forward group, getting some youth in the mix cannot hurt in the slightest bit. It is something I was very hopeful they would find a way to do this summer, and very grateful they found guys who are more or less ready to go. And look, it is way too early to be talking about, well, what are they going to get out of Ike Howard? What are they going to get out of Matthew Savoie? I know we're all excited. Prospects are a blank slate. We often project a lot onto these guys because we don't know what they are. They can be anything. They have the capacity to be great players, but they have to get there. They have to maximize their opportunities. They have to be in the right situations. There are so many factors that go into whether or not a player is successful in any sport, let alone in hockey, which has the most variance of any sport of the 4 North American leagues. But Sitting here now, thinking about Howard, thinking about Savoie, thinking about Podkolzin, all of those guys have varying degrees of upside. All of those guys have enough upside that you can talk yourself into a little bit better. And look, I'm not saying that either any of those three, Podkolzin, Savoie, or Howard, or Dave Tomasek for that matter, are going to replace your Victor Arvidsson, Evander Kane, and Jeff Skinner production. I don't think it's pragmatic to assume that three guys with minimal NHL experience are going to be able to put together 50, 60 goals. I think a good outcome would be about 30 to 40 between those three guys. I think of the three of them being Tomasek, Savoie, and Ike Howard combined for 35 goals, I think you'd feel pretty good about that based on where they're at. And I do think something I'm excited to see and something I'm genuinely curious about, I want to see Chris Knobloch's mentality with these young guys, because if he gives them the training wheels and lets them play and try and build themselves up, make mistakes, learn, grow, they're going to have so many more opportunities. And I really do think if Chris Knobloch is patient, I really do think they have the capacity to squeeze juice out of fruit that they desperately need offense from. Because you look at this lineup on Daily Faceoff right now, it's not very proven. There is not a lot here in terms of what you can expect. Look, Connor and Leon are two of the 5 best players in the world. You don't really got to worry about them. You have Ike Howard, you have Andrew Mangiapane, you have Vasily Podkolzin, you have Trent Frederick, you have Matthew Savoie. Okay, of those guys, Mangiapane has a 30-goal season under his belt, but that was a couple years ago. That was probably his career best. Podkolzin had his best season last year. That's the most games and minutes he's ever played. Trent Frederick's coming off a pretty serious injury. His career average in goals in a season is 13. The Oilers are going to need offense. It has to come from somewhere. The reason I am optimistic at large about the Oilers' capacity to win something this year is in part because guys like Savoie and guys like Howard have upside to get to. Now, it is crucial the Oilers do what they can to facilitate those guys getting to their maximum skill set, developing confidence in their games so they're able to do things creatively in the offensive zone and learning to be defensively responsible. And most importantly, finding a way to gel with McDavid, with Draisaitl. And I think that's where I want to end this second segment. Based on track record and arguably based on talent, Arvidsson and Skinner are better than Ike Howard, Matthew Savoie. Based on track record, based on expectations, they are more proven. You can make a strong argument those guys are better than their replacements. But Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson are pretty locked into what they are at this point in their careers. I think Skinner is a 15 to 20 goal guy on the Sharks, maybe 25 because he'll play more minutes because it's not a particularly good team. I think Arvidsson is probably a 40 to 50 point forward in the right situation. I think if we're talking about Howard, if he can score 15 goals next year as a rookie, that would be tremendous. I think Matthew Savoie, if he could contribute 30 to 40 points next year, that would go a long way. And most importantly and most excitedly, if you have these guys in the mix and you start to really build them up, you give yourself more options, because then maybe we're not going to play Nugent-Hopkins on the first line left wing and he's going to be the third line center because we want to play Ike Howard with McDavid, or we want to play Podkolzin with McDavid. And the more interchangeability you have, the more options you have to get more out of Connor and Leon. And I do think you got to do what you can to get more, because look, Connor didn't have a bad season by any stretch. He was top 10 in points and he missed a bunch of games last year. I do think there is more offense to squeeze out. I do think the Oilers need to find slightly more efficient offense when McDavid's out on the ice. And I think by extension, if you can get Leon a better winger than Kasperi Kapanen and Victor Arvidsson type guys on his right, I think there's a lot more juice to squeeze there. And look, I know he led the league in goals. I know he should have won the Hart Trophy, but that's a really good hockey player. And just because the counting stats vary year to year, I do think there is something to be said for getting those guys, Connor and Leon, better line mates, more explosive line mates, more dynamic line mates, because that's going to open more doors for your best players. And the more your best players are your best players, the better chance you're going to have to win if you're the Oilers. We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, I'm going to tell you why non-hockey reasons might be the single biggest reason I believe in this group. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, high-stakes soccer action, or the WNBA, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. If you're already following the action, why not make it a little more exciting? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are out getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel for a while now. It is the best way to make games a little more exciting. My friends and I love to watch a game together, put together a squad ride, whether it's a standalone or a parlay, and then we dig in. And FanDuel makes it so easy, whether it's before or after the game has started. And there's never been a better time to sign up, because if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, as we are in almost the dog days of summer, where it is unequivocally a interesting time for our league, because a majority of it is hibernating right now. A lot of teams, they're not shut down for the summer, but a lot of teams are taking some R&R. A lot of teams, a lot of media entities are effectively signed off for most of July. If trades break, if transactions of some kind happen, they'll get reported. But by and large, we are operating in the noise vacuum, where it'll be a lot of chatter. You'll hear a lot about, is McDavid going to sign? You'll keep hearing these little tidbits drop about why Mitch Marner chose to sign in Vegas to make him look bad in Toronto. You'll continue to hear these GM redemption stories of, oh, well, the team did X, Y, and Z last year, so the GM needs to try and do this year. And look, we all have to guess right now, because without games to be played, we can only go off of what has already happened. And speaking of what's already happened, and I do think, and I have long maintained this position, and I do think it's true even now, I think the more times you go on, make the playoffs, the more times you go to a conference final, a cup final, the better your team will ultimately be. And look, part of this process of going from being a good team to a championship team is figuring out who in your lineup, who on your roster works. And we have seen the Oilers now for 2 years try and retune that roster around these different ideas. You know, after losing the first time to Florida, they opted for more goal scoring. They went out and got Skinner and Arvidsson. You saw them bring in John Klingberg, trade for Jake Walman. You saw them go full tilt towards, we need more offense, we need more chance creation. We'll figure out the goaltending and the defense. Because we're going to score so much, because we're going to have the puck so much, we can get by with lesser defense, with lesser goaltending. And I think this year, after losing to Florida the way they did a second year in a row, I think the Oilers looked at themselves and said, we need to set up our next version of this team. Because a year from now, you're going to need to replace Matthias Ekholm and Adam Henrique. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Zach Hyman are going to be 33, 34 years old. Nurse is going to be in his early 30s. And Connor and Leon will have new contracts, and Evan Bouchard will have that mid-length contract. He's on the 4-year deal. But we need to start planning for what the next version of the Oilers is going to be. Are we going to try and get in on a superstar next summer in addition to McDavid? Are we going to try and go and get somebody for Connor and Leon to play off of? Or are we going to try and get a little more creative in our roster construction? Are we going to target restricted free agents or college free agents or European free agents to try and make up some of the gaps because we are so cap inflexible? And I really do think, and the examples I always give, Tampa Bay drafted Steven Stamkos in 2009. They didn't win a cup till 2020. The Blues drafted guys like Alex Pietrangelo almost a full decade before they won a cup. Vegas, 7 years, that's not the best example. Colorado, you drafted Nathan McKinnon in 2014. You win the cup 8 years later. I do think there is something to be said for getting to the playoffs over and over again, getting your best players as much experience as possible, and then trying to figure out what the right version of your team is. Because you could have seen some of these teams, like Florida, for example, after they won the President's Trophy in 2021, they lost in the second round to Tampa Bay, who ultimately went on to win the Cup again. But Florida could have kept running it back with Huberdeau and Weegar and instead said, we need to change things here. And I don't think there's that type of trade for the Oilers, short of trading a McDavid and trying to get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 assets in return. But you're never going to recreate what Connor brings to the table in the aggregate. So I don't think that's the case. I think, if anything, if you're looking for what that next move for the Oilers is, it's identifying the long-term Ekholm replacement. Now, whether that's Jake Walman, whether that's somebody who's not in the organization right now, that's an excellent question. But I do think the Oilers, as much as this episode is about why I think they're capable of winning the Stanley Cup this year, a lot of it's going to come down to the circumstances. I think they have a good chance to be the second or third best team in the Pacific. I think Vegas is unequivocally better. I think the Oilers can be better than the Kings in the regular season, the Canucks. I think they're better than the Flames, the 3 California teams, San Jose, LA, and Anaheim. I think they should be better than the wildcard teams from the Central, potentially a Utah. Winnipeg, Dallas, Colorado will likely be playoff teams. St. Louis had a nice season this year. They could potentially be in the mix, but we've seen it. The Oilers have beat the Stars in the conference finals in consecutive years. You beat LA 4 years in a row. You have beat the Canucks once. You beat the Flames once. Now the question becomes, can you do it again? And can you keep getting better? And that's the hardest part, man, because it's not just enough to maintain where you are. It is also about continuing to improve, because where you were at already wasn't good enough. And this is something that's hard for people to wrap their heads around at times. It's not just, hey, we didn't get the breaks, blah, blah. No, we might not have gotten the breaks. We could have had some things go our way a little bit more in a certain game or a certain series. But at large, you need to find a way to improve your team to make up for whatever deficiencies you'd have, so you get better variance. Because ultimately, and I do genuinely believe this, you make your own luck. You can put yourself in a position to get lucky if you work hard, if you play the game the right way, if you put that effort in and the right circumstances line up, you can make something really special happen. It's one of the real beautiful things about professional sports, that you can make your own luck. If you're playing the game the right way, eventually the bounces will start coming for you. And the Oilers have had really good stretches of hockey, whether it was the Dallas series or the Vegas series. They started to get going against teams that I think a lot of people, including me, perceived as more talented. It showed me a lot about them. And it's not a question about mental fortitude or wanting to win. It's simply a matter of, do they have enough talent? And I think they are capable of playing with anyone in the West. I do think the questions about Howard, Savoie, Podkolzin, Mangiapane, Trent Frederick, I think the winger question will ultimately define this upcoming season. But I do think the Oilers are very much in the mix. I think they're probably the 3rd or 4th best team in the West. As the last 2 years have shown, they don't really need home ice. They don't really need to be a high seed, but they make things happen. And that's a sign of a quality hockey team. That will do it for today's Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please take an extra second, leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit the alarm bell to get a notification whenever new content goes live. Let me know down in the comments how optimistic you are about the Oilers this upcoming season. Before we get out of here, be sure to check out Locked On NHL. And over on the Locked On NHL Game Night feed, the guys are doing season previews, going team by team. We did ours for the Oilers last week. They are making their way through all 32 teams ahead of October, so be sure to check that out. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.